I remember the exact sound the paper made when it hit my front door. Sharp, official, final, like something that didn't ask permission to exist. And before I even picked it up, I could already feel the shift in the air, that subtle pressure like a storm rolling in over dry land. The kind you don't see yet, but you know it's coming for you anyway. And when I opened it, standing barefoot on the old cedar porch my father built with his own hands back in 1989, the smell of sun-warmed wood and cut grass still hanging in the late afternoon heat. I read the words twice just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding something simple, something harmless. But there it was in clean black ink. Notice of property seizure, authorized by the board, effective immediately. And for a second, everything went quiet. Not outside, because I could still hear the cicadas buzzing and a pickup truck rumbling down County Road 12 about half a mile out. But inside, like someone had reached in and turned the volume of the world down to zero. This farmhouse isn't just a structure. It's 2,400 square feet of memory, sitting on 11.7 acres of land my grandfather cleared by hand. It's the chipped white railing I repainted every summer. The screen door that still sticks if you don't lift it just right. The kitchen window that catches the sunrise at exactly 6:14 a.m. in July. And these people who moved into the subdivision down the hill less than 3 years ago, thought they could take it with paperwork and a vote. I didn't slam the door, didn't call anyone, didn't even curse. I just folded the notice once, cleaned down the middle, and slid it into my back pocket like it was just another receipt I'd deal with later. Because the thing about pressure is, if you've lived with it long enough, you learn how to carry it without letting it show. By the time their SUVs started rolling up the gravel drive, tires crunching loud against the stones I laid myself, engines humming too smooth for a place like this. The sun was dipping low enough to cast long shadows across the pasture, and I could see them step out one by one, polished shoes, pressed shirts, sunglasses that never quite came off, like they were afraid to actually look at the place they were trying to take. Margaret Cole was in the center, of course, clipboard in hand, posture straight, smile tight enough to cut glass. The kind of smile that pretends to be polite while it measures you for something smaller, something easier to remove. And when she walked up those steps, heels clicking against the wood like she owned every inch of it already, she didn't ask if I'd read the notice, didn't ask if I had questions. She just said, "Mr. Blake, the board has made its decision." Like that was the end of the conversation, like the last 100 years of this land could be summarized in a sentence and filed away. I leaned against the doorframe, arms loose at my sides, feeling the heat of the day still trapped in the wood behind me. And I watched them talk, watched them explain zoning updates and compliance issues and community standards as if any of that had ever mattered out here, as if gravel roads and open fields needed approval from people who measured grass with rulers and called it governance. And the whole time, I didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't give them anything they could push against, because that's the part nobody ever sees coming. The silence. Margaret's smile sharpened when I didn't react, like she was waiting for something louder, something messy, something she could write down and use later, but all I did was nod once, slow, like I was considering a fair offer, and I could almost hear what she was thinking, that she'd already won, that this was just procedure now, just signatures and timelines and keys handed over at the end of a clean, controlled process. What she didn't know, what none of them knew as they stood there on my porch, talking about my home like it was already theirs, was that every document they'd filed, every loan they'd leveraged, every expansion they'd approved down in that neat little subdivision below the hill, all of it ran through a system they'd never bothered to question. And systems, unlike people, don't care about smiles or votes or how many names you can fit on a board. They care about who holds the paper, and I'd been holding the right paper for a long time. The moment they left, the gravel settled back into silence, but the air did not feel the same. It felt thinner somehow, like something had been taken even before anything was signed. And I stood there on the porch a few seconds longer than necessary, listening to the echo of their footsteps fade into the hum of their engines pulling away down the drive, each tire pressing into land they believed they already owned. And when the last vehicle disappeared past the oak tree at the bend, I reached into my back pocket, unfolded that notice again, and read it slower this time, line by line, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to see exactly how far they thought they could go. The language was clean, confident, The kind of wording that assumes no one is going to challenge it. Zoning noncompliance, structural inconsistency, integration into community planning district. Phrases stacked neatly like bricks forming a wall they expected me to accept without question, but buried in the margins, in the fine print most people skip, were the numbers, account references, lending disclosures, the quiet fingerprints of something bigger than a neighborhood board trying to play government. I stepped inside, the screen door snapping shut behind me with that familiar click, and the house greeted me the way it always did, cool air rolling off the old vents. The faint smell of black coffee still sitting in the pot from earlier that morning, the worn floorboards creaking under my boots in. A pattern I could walk blindfolded. And for a moment, I let myself just stand in the middle of the living room, looking at the walls lined with photographs, my grandfather in overalls leaning against a tractor, my father holding me up on this very porch when I was barely tall enough to see over the railing. All of it still here, still intact, still mine. I walked over to the desk in the corner. The one most people would think is just an old piece of furniture with a drawer that sticks if you pull it too fast, and I opened it carefully, sliding past a stack of receipts, a few handwritten notes, until my fingers found the folder I had not needed to touch in a long time. Heavy paper, crisp edges, the kind of documentation that does not bend easily and does not disappear just because someone files a complaint. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of dry grass through the open window, and I could hear a distant lawnmower from one of the houses down the hill. That neat little grid of homes they called a community, each one financed, approved, and maintained through channels they never questioned. Because most people do not question systems that work in their favor. I set the notice from the board next to the documents on the desk, aligning the edges without thinking, and the contrast was almost amusing. Their paper loud with authority, mine quiet with weight, and I ran my thumb along the corner of the folder, feeling that familiar texture, the one that always reminded me that power does not always look like power when you are holding it. Sometimes it looks like patience, like restraint, like knowing exactly when not to speak. They thought this was about land, about fences and permits, and whether a farmhouse fit into their version of progress. But standing there in that room, with the late afternoon light cutting across the floor in long golden lines, I knew something they did not, something they had not even considered when they drafted that notice and walked up my steps like they were closing a deal. And it was simple enough that it almost felt unfair, because every signature they had relied on, every approval they had waved in my face, every financial step that made their expansion possible, all of it traced back to a single institution, one they trusted without ever asking who stood behind it. And as I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it for just a second, I realized they had not come to take my home. Not really. They had walked straight into something they did not understand. And the only reason they were still smiling when they left was because I had not given them a reason to stop yet. The next morning came in quiet, the kind of quiet that feels intentional, like the world is holding its breath just to see what you are going to do next. And I woke up before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, the sky still washed in. That pale gray blue that comes right before everything turns gold. And for a second, I just lay there listening. The ceiling fan clicking softly overhead, the distant hum of a truck miles away, the same sounds that had always been there, unchanged, steady, like this place itself refused to acknowledge what had happened the day before. I swung my feet onto the floor, the wood cool under my soles, and walked straight to the kitchen without turning on a single light, because I did not need to see where I was going. Not here. Not in a house where every step had been memorized over decades. And as the coffee maker sputtered to life, filling the room with that rich, familiar smell, I unfolded the notice again and laid it flat on the counter next to the folder I had pulled out the night before, the contrast sharper in the morning light, their document loud with authority, mine quiet with certainty. Outside, I could see the first movement down the hill, sprinklers clicking on in perfect sequence across those manicured lawns, water arcing through the air in identical patterns, every house waking up on schedule, every routine predictable, controlled, financed, and I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the heat settle, because this was the part most people rush through, the part where emotion tries to take over and push you into reacting too fast, saying too much, giving away the one thing you cannot afford to lose, which is time. I picked up my phone, not to call anyone from the board, not to argue, but to check something simple, something they had included without thinking twice. The reference number printed in the lower right corner of their notice, a small string of digits tied to their development financing, and I entered it into a system most people never see. A system that does not care about titles like president or chairman, a system that reduces everything to numbers, risk, exposure, leverage. The screen loaded slowly, not because it was struggling, but because it was thorough, and when the details appeared, it was exactly what I expected. Every loan tied neatly together, every phase of their subdivision expansion linked back to a single institution, one pipeline, feeding everything they had built, from the roads to the homes to the little clubhouse where they held their meetings and voted on decisions like the one they tried to hand me yesterday. I set the phone down and looked out the window again, watching one of their board members jog past the edge of my property line, earbuds in, posture relaxed, completely unaware of how thin the ground beneath their plans actually was. And it almost made me smile, not out of arrogance, but because of how predictable it all was, how often people mistake structure for security without ever checking who holds the foundation together. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and set it in the sink with the same care I always had, because nothing about my routine needed to change, not yet. And as I walked back into the living room, I picked up the folder again, feeling its weight settle into my hand like something familiar, something earned, and I realized that the board had already crossed the line. They thought they controlled, they just did not know it yet, because the moment they filed that notice, the moment they put their names on paper tied to obligations they barely understood, they had already invited the one response they could not outvote, could not pressure, could not talk their way around. And I had no intention of rushing it, because when you know exactly where the pressure points are, you do not need to raise your voice. You just need to wait for the right moment to press. By mid-morning, the sun had burned off the last of the haze and the heat settled in across the fields like it always did this time of year, steady and patient, and I was out by the fence line with a wrench in my hand, tightening a loose hinge that had not really needed fixing, but it gave me something to do while I watched the road below. Because routine has a way of keeping everything grounded when the rest of the situation starts drifting into something else entirely. I could see the subdivision clearly from that angle. Rows of houses lined up like they had been placed with a ruler, identical driveways, identical mailboxes, the kind of uniformity that looks clean from a distance but tells you nothing about what is holding it together underneath. And right on schedule, around 10:30, the first sign of movement started at the clubhouse parking lot. A couple of board members gathering again, probably reviewing timelines, signatures, next steps, the same process they had followed a dozen times before with smaller disputes they could easily win. I leaned against the fence post, feeling the rough grain press into my palm, and took a slow breath, letting the smell of dry soil and warm grass settle in, because this was the stage where most people make their mistake. They react too early. They show their hand before the other side has fully committed, and I had no intention of doing that. Instead, I walked back up to the house, boots tapping against the wooden steps, the screen door giving that familiar snap as I stepped inside, and I went straight to the desk again, pulling out a single sheet from the folder, not the entire stack, just one page, the one with the header most people would recognize if they ever bothered to look closely at where their money actually moved, and I placed it next to the board's notice once more, aligning the corners like two pieces of a puzzle that did not belong together yet somehow fit perfectly. The phone rang right on time, not loud, just a steady tone that cut through the quiet, and I let it ring once, twice, before picking it up, because timing matters even in the smallest details. And when I answered, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, the kind of voice that does not ask unnecessary questions, just confirms facts, numbers, positions, and I gave them exactly what they needed, no more, no less, referencing the account number, the development portfolio, the exposure level tied to that subdivision down the hill. And there was a brief pause on the line, not confusion, but recognition. The kind that happens when someone realizes the full shape of a situation they were only partially aware of before. I hung up without saying anything extra and set the phone back down on the desk, the weight of that simple action settling in the room like a shift in pressure you cannot see but can definitely feel. And outside, a breeze pushed through the open window, rustling the papers just enough to remind me they were still there, still waiting. I stepped back out onto the porch, resting my hands on the railing, looking down at the same road Margaret and her board had driven up the day before, and for a moment, everything looked exactly the same. The same sunlight, the same stretch of gravel, the same quiet stretch of land that had been here long before any of them showed up with their plans and their votes. But underneath that surface, something had already started moving, something they could not see from their side of the hill, something that did not announce itself with raised voices or warnings, because the real shifts never do. I watched as one of their SUVs pulled out from the subdivision and headed toward town, probably another meeting, another attempt to move things forward, and I knew exactly where they were going before they even reached the main road. Because when every step you take depends on a system you do not control, you tend to follow the same paths over and over again without realizing it. And as I stood there, feeling the heat settle into the wood beneath my hands, I understood that they still believed they were in charge of what came next, that they were driving this forward, making decisions, setting timelines. But the truth was simpler than that. They had already set something in motion the moment they decided to come up my drive with that notice, and now it was just a matter of letting the process do what it was designed to do, because power does not rush, it waits until everything is in place, and then it moves all at once. By early afternoon, the heat had settled into everything, pressing down on the fields, the roof, the gravel drive, the kind of steady weight that makes time feel slower than it actually is, and I stayed exactly where I had been most of the day, moving through small, ordinary tasks that did not need to be done but kept everything looking the same. Because consistency is its own kind of message. From the porch, I could see more movement down in the subdivision than usual, cars pulling in and out of the main entrance, a few people standing in small groups near the clubhouse, not relaxed this time, not casual, their posture tighter, conversations shorter, and even from that distance, you could tell something had shifted, not enough to cause panic yet, but enough to interrupt the rhythm they were used to. I leaned back in the chair, the wood warm against my shoulders, and listened as the wind moved through the trees behind the house, carrying that dry, dusty smell that always came with long afternoons like this, and I did not need to check my phone to know the sequence had already begun, because systems do not hesitate once they recognize a trigger, they follow through, step by step, whether anyone is ready or not. Down the hill, one of their board members, a man I had seen standing beside Margaret the day before, walked quickly across the parking lot with a phone pressed to his ear, his free hand moving in short, sharp gestures, the kind people make when they are trying to control a conversation that is no longer going their way. And a second car pulled up beside him, another member stepping out, face tight, eyes scanning like they were looking for answers that were not written down anywhere they could see. I stood up slowly and walked to the edge of the porch, resting my hands on the railing again, feeling the grain under my fingers, grounding, steady, the same wood that had been there long before any of this started, and for a moment, I just watched them, not with satisfaction, not yet, but with a quiet understanding of how quickly confidence can shift when the foundation beneath it starts to move. Inside the house, the phone remained silent now, which told me everything I needed to know, because the kind of calls that had already been made do not repeat themselves. They cascade outward, touching every point connected to the original line. And the board had built their entire expansion on connections they assumed would always be there, always available, always unquestioned. I stepped back inside briefly, glancing at the papers still laid out on the desk, the notice they had delivered sitting beside the documents they had never thought to look for, and the difference between them felt even clearer now. One built on assumption, the other on structure, one loud, the other final. When I returned to the porch, another SUV pulled out of the subdivision faster than the others had earlier, tires kicking up more dust than necessary, heading toward town, toward answers, toward people who would not be able to give them what they wanted anymore. And I could almost trace the path in my mind, the offices, the desks, the conversations that would now sound very different than they had just a day before. The sun had started to angle west, stretching shadows longer across the pasture, and everything out here still looked calm, unchanged, like nothing had happened at all. But down below, the pattern had broken, the smooth routine replaced by something uncertain, something they could not vote away or write off with another notice. And as I stood there, breathing in the dry air, listening to the distant hum of engines and voices carrying just far enough to be heard but not understood, I realized this was The moment most people miss, the exact point where control quietly changes hands without any announcement, without any confrontation, just a shift in how things respond when you try to move them. And they were starting to feel it now, even if they did not yet understand why. Late afternoon stretched into that slow golden hour where everything looks calm even when it is not. And I could see it clearly now, the difference between yesterday and today written in small movements, in how people stood, how long they stayed on their phones, how often they looked toward the road instead of at each other. And it did not take much to understand what was happening behind the scenes, because I had seen it before in other places. Different faces, same pattern. I stepped down off the porch and walked a few yards into the field, the grass brushing against my jeans, dry and brittle from the heat. And from there the view opened up even more, giving me a clear line straight to the subdivision entrance where another cluster of vehicles had gathered, not neatly parked this time, but angled, overlapping, like people who had arrived in a hurry and had not thought about how it looked. Margaret's car was there. I could tell from the shine and the way it was positioned slightly ahead of the others, and she stood near the hood with that same clipboard in her hand. But she was not speaking now, not leading. She was listening, head tilted slightly, lips pressed together, the kind of posture that only shows up when confidence has been replaced by calculation. I let my gaze drift past them to the road beyond, toward town, toward the offices where signatures carry more weight than any vote taken in a clubhouse, and I could almost map the conversations happening in real time, accounts being reviewed, numbers being flagged, questions being asked that had not been asked yesterday, not because anyone had changed their mind, but because the structure itself had shifted just enough to reveal what was underneath. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, pushing through the field and across the porch behind me, rattling the screen door just enough to make that familiar tapping sound, and I turned back toward the house, walking slowly, not rushing, because nothing about this needed to be rushed anymore. Inside, the air felt cooler, quieter, like it always did when the day started leaning toward evening, and the papers on the desk had not moved, still aligned, still waiting, the board's notice sitting there like a statement they believed was final, and beside it, the documents they had never considered, the ones that did not need bold language or official stamps to carry weight. I ran my hand along the edge of the desk, feeling the smooth, worn surface, and for a moment, I thought about how many decisions get made on paper without anyone truly understanding the chain that supports them. How many people sign their names assuming the ground beneath them is solid simply because it has always been there, and how quickly that assumption can change when something upstream shifts. Outside, a car engine revved harder than necessary, tires crunching sharply as someone pulled away from the gathering below, and I stepped back onto the porch just in time to see it accelerate toward town, faster than before, urgency replacing routine, and that was the first real sign, not panic, not yet, but awareness, the moment when people realize they are no longer dealing with something they can control internally. I rested my hands on the railing again, looking down at the same stretch of land that had not changed at all through any of this, and I understood exactly where they were in the process now, caught between what they thought they knew and what was beginning to unfold, trying to reconcile the two before it moved any further. But systems do not pause for reconciliation, they move forward based on input, and the input had already been set in motion. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the field and stretching the lines of the fence out toward the subdivision like quiet markers of something older, something more permanent than any board decision. And as the light softened and the noise below continued in short bursts of movement and conversation, I knew the next step was not mine to take in person, not with words or arguments, but through the same channels they had relied on without question, the same structure that now recognized a different set of priorities. And when that structure finishes aligning, it does not ask for permission, it simply changes what is possible. By the time the sun slipped behind the tree line, the light turned softer, but the tension down the hill sharpened, like something invisible had tightened around everything they were trying to hold together. And I could see it in the way the clubhouse lights came on earlier than usual, bright rectangles cutting into the dusk, silhouettes moving back and forth inside, faster than before, more frequent, like conversations were stacking on top of each other without resolution. I stayed on the porch, not sitting this time, just standing with one hand resting on the railing, feeling the last of the day's warmth fade from the wood. and I watched as another pair of headlights pulled into the lot, then another, until the place that used to look orderly and predictable started to resemble something else entirely, something reactive, something uncertain. Margaret stepped out again, the same posture, the same controlled movements. But there was a difference now, subtle, but there, her shoulders held tighter, her steps more deliberate, like she was choosing every motion instead of moving on instinct, and she disappeared inside without the usual pause to address the others, which told me more than any conversation I could have overheard. Inside the house, my phone remained still on the desk, but I knew that silence meant the process had reached the point where it no longer needed input. It was executing, moving through channels and departments and approvals that did not require discussion, just confirmation, and once that kind of system starts moving, it does not reverse just because someone realizes they made the wrong assumption. I stepped back inside briefly, the air cooler now, the faint smell of coffee replaced by that quiet, neutral scent a house settles into at night, and I looked at the papers one more time. The notice they had served me sitting beside the documents that connected everything they had built to something they had never questioned, and for the first time since this started, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible shift in perspective, not relief, not satisfaction, just clarity. Outside, a car door slammed harder than necessary, the sound echoing up the hill, followed by voices, sharper now, overlapping, and I walked back out onto the porch just in time to see one of the board members pacing near the edge of the lot, phone pressed tight to his ear, his free hand running through his hair in quick, frustrated motions. While another stood near him, arms crossed, looking toward town like answers might come driving back up the road. The sky darkened into deep blue, the first stars just starting to show, and the subdivision lights flickered on one by one, illuminating rows of houses that suddenly looked less like a perfect plan and more like a network, each part connected, each dependent on the same underlying support they had assumed was permanent. I leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the railing, and let the night settle in around me, the distant hum of their activity mixing with the steady, familiar sounds of this land, crickets starting up, a breeze moving through the trees, everything here continuing exactly as it always had, unchanged, unaffected. They still had not come back up the drive, and that was the clearest sign of all, because if they believed their notice still held weight, if they believed they still controlled the outcome, they would have returned by now, louder, more forceful, ready to push things forward, but they had not, and that hesitation, that pause, that shift from action to reaction, meant the balance had already tipped. I straightened up, taking one last look down the hill, watching as the movement continued in uneven bursts, conversations breaking apart and reforming without resolution, and I knew exactly what the next step would be, not from me, not with a phone call or a visit, but from the same system they had leaned on to justify their decision, the same structure now recalibrating around a different priority. And when that final piece clicks into place, it does not ask who is ready. It simply defines what happens next. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a slow wash of pale light stretching across the fields, the kind that makes everything look the same at first glance even when it is not. And I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in my hand, the air cooler now, carrying that faint mix of damp earth and cut grass that always settles in after a long night. And for a moment, I just stood there, letting the quiet settle in, because after everything that had moved beneath the surface, this was the part where you see what remains. Down the hill, the subdivision looked different, not in structure, not in layout, but in energy, fewer cars, slower movement, no clusters of people outside the clubhouse, just a couple of vehicles parked at uneven angles like they had been left there overnight without a plan to return quickly, and the windows that had been lit late into the night were dark now, reflecting the early sunlight instead of broadcasting activity. I took a slow sip of coffee, the heat steady, grounding, and leaned against the railing, watching as one of the board members stepped out of the clubhouse, not in a hurry this time, not on the phone, just standing there for a second like he was trying to decide what to do next without the usual structure guiding him. And then he walked to his car, got in, and drove away without looking back. There was no announcement, no official statement delivered up my drive, no attempt to follow through on the notice they had handed me. And that told me everything I needed to know, because when people believe they still have authority, they act on it. They reinforce it. They push it forward. But when that authority disappears, even quietly, the first thing that changes is action. It slows, it hesitates, it stops. I stepped back inside, setting the mug down on the counter, and walked over to the desk where the papers still lay. The notice from the board now, just another piece of paper, its language unchanged, but its weight completely gone, and beside it, the documents that had never needed to announce themselves, never needed to be shown to anyone who did not already understand their place in the system. And I picked up the notice one last time, folding it along. The same line as before, not out of habit, but because it no longer deserved more attention than that. Outside, the wind moved lightly through the trees, the same steady rhythm that had been there long before any of this started, and I stepped back onto the porch, looking out across the land that had not shifted, had not reacted, had simply remained exactly what it was, solid, patient, unchanged. No one came up the drive that morning. No SUVs, no clipboards, no carefully worded explanations. Just the quiet stretch of gravel leading up to a house that still stood exactly where it always had. And down below, the subdivision continued to exist, but differently now, not as something expanding, not as something pushing outward, but as something recalibrating within limits it had not expected to face. I rested my hands on the railing, feeling the grain beneath my fingers, and let out a slow breath I had not realized I had been holding, not from relief, but from completion, because this was never about winning in a loud way, never about standing in front of them and proving anything. It was about understanding where real control sits and letting it do what it was built to do. They came with paper and authority, with decisions they believed were final, and they left without needing to be told they were wrong, because the system they trusted had already answered that for them in a language they could not argue with. And as the morning settled in and the sun climbed higher over